Hi, everybody, and welcome to Uncast, a podcast all about the benefits of owning your own server, the Unraid community, technology enthusiasm, and relevant news. I'm your host, Jon Panozzo, and for this first episode, I want to start actually by discussing why you should own your own server. And while many of you probably already do, I'm sure you know many that don't, and the next time you talk with them, there are a few things you can bring up to help them see the light. The first is personal data responsibility. So we live in an era of cloud-based solutions for all of our storage needs. Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and all the rest are working very hard to convince us that each day we don't need to worry about our data because they got us covered. And service providers have done a great job of making the gigantic complex mess that is the internet seem like no big deal for providing you with access to your stuff. But blindly trusting the cloud as the primary location for storing all of your data comes with additional costs and risks that might not be too obvious at first. What would happen if you lost access to your account or got banned for some reason? What recourse would you have to get access to your data? And what about bandwidth limits, internet outages? And let's not forget about the ever-changing EULA terms, the licensing agreements. Let's just give you a concrete example. We'll talk about Google Photos. So in November of last year, Google announced that they were ending their unlimited high-quality photo storage policy. And while this doesn't affect Pixel 1 through 5 users, as they will continue to receive the benefits of unlimited high-quality photo storage, Google also announced that future Pixel phones won't continue to receive that benefit. So the new cap on photo storage is tethered to your total Google Drive storage, which is capped at 15 gigabytes across all applications, meaning Gmail, Drive, Photos, etc. So think about it. Just how much email do you save? What about photos? That 15 gigs is going to get chewed up really, really fast. And when I heard the thing about Pixel users and 1 through 5 not being affected, basically what they said was, with Pixel 1 through 5 users, you will still be able to upload these high-quality photos as much as you want. But at some point, those Pixel 1 through 5 users are going to upgrade their phone. They're not going to stay on the same Pixel device forever. And when they do, Google also announced in, I think, the same month last year, that future Pixel phones wouldn't continue to receive that benefit. So at some point, you're going to start paying to store all that data. So this is kind of an interesting strategy for Google to use these promises of free to get people to commit large gobs of data to them, to only later kind of pull the rug out from underneath them and say, hey, now you've got to start paying. And even though that old stuff is still going to be stored for free, you're not going to end up in a scenario where you have some of your data living there and some of your data living somewhere else. They know that. They know that it's inconvenient to have multiple platforms for that. So ultimately, all of these cloud companies, whenever you see a cloud service that is offered for free, you should highly question it, because free offerings, especially for storage, for cloud offerings for things that are not storage related, I don't have as much concern about. But when there's storage involved and they're storing your data, you've got to be careful with that, because over time, things might change. The policies might change. And I'd rather pay for something up front, knowing that that's what the intention is, than getting something for free and then one day having the rug pulled out from underneath me. So, what I learned about cloud providers as a result of policies like this and others, this is not just Google, by the way. I might be picking on them a lot. And keep in mind, I love Google. I use Google all the time. I'm not challenging them as a company or the technologies that they create. What I'm specifically challenging is the storage and how they're charging for that, and the way that they're going about ultimately turning that into a profit center for them. So when I think about cloud providers, terms can change whenever they want. The EULAs that you have to click I agree to, there's a policy in almost every single one of them that says these terms can be changed at any time, whenever the company wants. Those EULAs are not there to protect the user. They are there to protect the company. So this means you really can't rely on promises made by these companies. A promise is always temporary with them. And eventually, if they want to change something, they can. And what most importantly you need to remember is that ultimately you are responsible for your own data. If you chose to let Google store everything, and you're the technologist of the family, for example, if you've got a wife and kids, and one day something happens and you lose access to that, or for some reason or another, your content is no longer as high quality as you once remember because they degraded it for some reason, it's ultimately on you, right? Your wife is not going to accept that Google did something. Like, she's going to be like, "Aren't you the technology guy? Aren't you supposed to be taking care of us?" Like, that's what my wife would say to me, guaranteed. So you really got to take ownership of that data storage. And so, it's not to say that you shouldn't use the cloud or that you shouldn't use Google Photos because it makes it easy to share stuff with other people. That's fine. But using it as the only place to store your data and specifically your memories, it's just not a smart move. And we should also talk about something else, which is this whole concept of what Google calls high quality versus original photos. So what Google promised Pixel users was that all the photos you take on those devices would be free to store so long as they were stored in what they call high quality mode. And what that means is lower quality than original. They call it high quality, but there's really only two options. There's high quality and original quality. And guess which one is higher quality? Original. The original quality is always going to be the best. That's the uncompressed, raw, original picture or video. But what Google did is they came up with this term called high quality. And what that means is that content is going to be compressed. So anything over 16 megapixels on a camera, that's any photo taken with a greater than 16 megapixel camera, is going to be compressed. And this means that some high quality images might appear a little dull or pixelated. This also affects video. Any video that's recorded above 1080p is auto compressed to 1080p. And so what does this all mean? What is this really about? Well, I kind of question the value of these new modern mobile devices with these super high resolution cameras and 4K video capture capability if when you do that, it's only going to last as long as the content lives on your device. And as soon as it goes to the cloud, it's degraded to look like a picture taken from a few years back. Like that, it's very confusing to me as a user because it seems kind of like a bait and switch. It seems kind of like, hey, you take these pictures, look at how beautiful this picture looks. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. But just give it 30 days until the cache has worn off your local device and it's up in the cloud and you look at it again, you're like, it's not quite as good as I remember. Now, I'm not saying that 16 megapixels isn't good quality. I can look through my Google Photos and I can see my memories and yes, they are of pretty decent quality. I'm not gonna knock them completely. But the point is that Google has started down this path of making you choose between getting the raw original quality of what you took or some reduced quality version. And that means that this can continue to change over time. If you think that down the road this 16 megapixels is going to stay, it can't. At some point, it's either got to go up, right? Because as quality of technology gets better, the shift is going to have to go up. But then that also might mean that cost gets introduced into the equation. And maybe Google starts charging now for high quality, and they add another option called medium quality or low quality. And so you just have to be cognizant that this stuff is not a product, it's a service. And if that service decides to change things, they can do it at any time they want. And they can give you notice. They can say things like, hey, you have 3 months to get all of your photos off of our platform onto something else if you don't want them to be further compressed. But how many of you could react that quickly? Even given a few months, how much money would it cost to come up with a solution on the fly like that? So my view is it's most important for you to keep all of the data that you create, all of your memories, specifically photos and videos. That's to me the most important stuff on a system that you own and control. Having it in the cloud as well is fine, but that way, if they decide to change the rules down the road and you don't like it, you still already have a solution in place to store all of your memories and store all of that content in an unmodified, uncompressed format that no one else has any control over and that no service provider can take away from you. All right, so that covers the personal data responsibility point. Now, second thing we have to talk about is reducing cloud dependence. Now, this is all about the idea of being able to do things without a cloud subscription. So a great example of this is what's happening with what has happened with LastPass. So for those that don't know, I think most do, but LastPass is a cloud-based solution for password management. So you create an account with LastPass, you download their apps to your PC and mobile devices, and the only username and password that you're really asked to remember is that of LastPass, and maybe your Windows computer password or whatever. Then LastPass actually syncs those passwords between your devices and automatically fills in username and password fields when connecting to specific sites or apps. So you're on your PC, you've logged into Facebook, it says, oh, I see you've logged in. Let me remember that password for you. Okay, great. Now you never have to log in with Facebook again. Now you pull up your mobile phone and you open up the Facebook app, and if you have the LastPass app on your mobile device, it'll automatically fill that in for you. So it's a super convenient service, very secure, more secure than I think using the same password for every site, which is what a lot of people do. And the reason that's not secure is that if someone does breach any one of those individual sites and get that one password, they'll now try that combination on a number of different sites to see if you have an account with them. And if you use the same login everywhere, then yeah, they'll get into everything. Now, when this thing was launched, it was made completely free for users with a few premium benefits tied to a paid subscription, such as the ability, I believe, to share and sync passwords with other users. So it seemed like a really good deal, right? Well, back in 2015, remote access company LogMeIn purchased LastPass for a whopping $110 million. And in 2019, it was announced that LogMeIn was being sold to a pair of private equity firms for $4.3 billion. Now, these private equity firms decided that the free tier of LastPass was leaving too much money on the table, so they decided to change the terms. They realized that the thing that was most valuable about LastPass was the fact that you could keep your passwords in sync between your two primary device types, PC and mobile. So this month, March, well, last month if you're listening to it now, March, LastPass forced all of its users to make a choice. Either start paying for a premium subscription or choose which device type you want to use with LastPass, either mobile or PC. So what does this really mean for users? Well, if you wanted to keep using LastPass for free, the best action you could probably take would be to choose mobile. And then whenever you would need to log into an app on your PC, you'd pull out your phone, open the app, manually look up the app login credentials, and then manually type them in on the PC. Like you're living in the Stone Age. Now, I'm not challenging the right that business owners have to change their products or offerings. It's completely within their legal right. But it's also within our legal right to be legitimately upset about that. LastPass convinced users to trust them with their most sensitive data, logins. And users spent gobs of time setting up LastPass and redoing all of their passwords across all of the sites and apps they use. And I know this firsthand because I was one of them. I had to go through this effort after I thought I was breached, and that was ultimately the precipice for me to go and set up a password management solution. And I'll tell you, it's not fun. It's not fun to sit there and have to log into every single site that you use and go through the password change for every single one and make sure that gets entered into the password manager correctly. It is a chore. It's a chore to say the least, especially when you're married or you live with somebody else and you share logins to things. It becomes even more complicated. So after all that effort, you go through all that effort, LastPass decided to issue an ultimatum to those users and gave them about 3 months to think about it. I think the announcement came out in January that they were going to do this, and they gave people till March to make a decision. And let's make no mistake about it, it was absolutely an ultimatum. So while it's not illegal, what LastPass decided to do, it certainly feels demoralizing as a user to have your free and safe password manager solution hijacked out from under you by some private equity firms that didn't even build the technology in the first place. So I'm now in the process of converting to Bitwarden, which allows you to configure a password management solution on your own server. So it's self-hosted. And that's a key thing that you should be listening for when you're thinking about services is the idea of them being self-hosted. Because self-hosted solutions are those that run on a box that you own and control. And that means that even if those solutions, if somebody decides down the road, I'm going to make a change to them, you decide when that update hits your server. You decide when to apply it. So you then can control the timeline and no one can hold that over your head. So I think that's a really big deal. And there's another thing to think about here when it comes to specifically password management and the benefit of being self-hosted. And that's the idea of a honeypot. And if you're not familiar with that, a honeypot basically refers to the idea of a single place that hackers would want to target. Now, there's another term for honeypot which refers to a trap, right? That companies can set up to lure hackers to come in. But what I'm referring to here is the idea that if I'm a hacker, right, and I want to target something, if I want to target something big, right, targeting some average guy's home server, not really a big target for me. I'm not interested in focusing all my effort on breaching something that only one person uses, because the amount of value that might find there as a hacker is going to pale in comparison to hacking a service provider that houses data for lots of users that could be super sensitive, right? So, and keep in mind, it doesn't matter how much LastPass talks about how encrypted things are and whatnot. Hackers don't have to necessarily gain access to the data. They could just scramble the data. They could just delete the data. What happens if LastPass lost all of the passwords for all of those services? Now, you could probably go in and hit forgot my password on each one of those one by one and go through the reset process one by one. But the point is that if you did have to do that because they screwed up, boy, would that be a real big problem. So I really question using these consolidated providers for something that sensitive. And we've definitely seen that there have been breaches on multiple password management solutions that I don't believe anyone's data was leaked to the point where their accounts were compromised, but the fact that the companies themselves were getting breached, it makes you a little bit nervous. So if you're interested in setting up Bitwarden on your own server, specifically on Unraid, our friendly community guy, Space Invader 1, did an amazing video in January of last year, actually, on how to set up Bitwarden on Unraid. We'll add a link to it in the description down below. So the point of this all is that when you sign up for a cloud service, it quickly becomes something that you rely upon. And while I'm not expecting anyone to run out and cancel their Netflix subscription tomorrow, I do think that when it comes to things like password managers and home automation or game streaming services, there are better, safer, and more cost-effective ways to do these things without involving another subscription. And that's what reducing cloud dependence is all about. So the last thing that we need to talk about is discovering what's possible. These are just some basic things that we've covered so far. But when we talk about modern hardware, modern PCs are incredibly powerful. The core counts on today's desktops, they just don't get utilized. It's almost hilarious that we're still doubling core counts or trying to increase core counts on desktop CPUs, because it feels like we're just doing it just because, right? Like, I'm not saying there's no use case for it, but the number of people out there that are buying these desktops with these really high core counts and just putting Windows on there so they can browse the web and maybe play a few games, they're not getting utilized. So it's like, if you have a modern processor with, say, 8 logical cores, let's say it's 4 plus 4 hyper-threaded, there might be some marginal gains going to 6 to 8 to 12, but for gaming and for browsing the web, you're not going to notice them very much. These extra core counts, what they're best at is doing things like video encoding, well, for GPUs, Bitcoin mining. Like, that's what really hits them hard. But just doing the basics, you're barely pushing the needle. So let's rewind the clock a bit for people that remember and had servers in their home back in, like, let's say the 90s, right? It was always a separate device. You always had this separate machine that lived in the house, if you had a home server, from your computer, from your phone, from everything else. And this has held true for a very long time. In fact, it was continuing to hold true until I joined LimeTech back in 2014. Back then, I even still had a separate Unraid box from my Windows desktop/gaming machine. But one of the big things that ultimately excited me about Unraid and led me to joining the company was this idea of adding virtualization support to Unraid, and more specifically, the idea of passing through a graphics card to a VM and using that for a full localized desktop computing experience. That, to me, was a huge, huge shift in the cost of having a home server, because previously I had to have 2 devices. I had to have my PC, right, which I used for work, I used for gaming, I used for all my personal needs, and then separately a server. And there were lots of reasons to do that. There were lots of reasons. One of which would be that you don't want server applications to be running on a Windows computer that might have to reboot at any given moment because of an update, or because you put a new piece of software on, or for whatever reason. And not to mention the fact that Windows, or I should say any desktop PC, anything that the user's sitting in front of and interacting with, is a higher risk of being infected with malware or a virus or something, because you're touching it, right? You're clicking things, and maybe you click something you shouldn't, and something gets installed that you don't want, and now all of that content that you've been storing on that Windows box is lost because of that decision. So we would have this in the IT industry. We called this concept separation of duties. You have a server and it has its job, and you have a desktop and it has its job, and you keep them separate from one another so that issues that affect one don't affect the other. That was the concept. But the problem with separation of duties, and this is something that we saw in the enterprise industry back in the day, was that it cost a lot. It cost a lot of money to address this concern. So what we would do is you go into a customer environment and you'd say, hey, Mr. Customer, all right, you want an email server, right? Okay, so we're going to set up, let's say, Microsoft Exchange for you. Okay, so then how many servers do I need for Microsoft Exchange? Well, you definitely need at least one server to run Exchange itself. And there are some services that are going to be installed on that Exchange server, like DNS, that are required. And that's not enough, though. You're going to need at least another server in order to have high availability, so that if the first server were to fail, the second server could automatically take over. Okay, and then actually you need another server that's at a separate location for disaster recovery. So if the place that the server was at were to blow up, you could fall over to another site. Oh, and you probably want another server at that disaster recovery site, so that if the disaster hits and the first site goes down and the second site kicks up, but something's wrong with that first server, then you have high availability at the disaster recovery site, right? Oh, and by the way, that's just for Exchange. Now let's talk about all the other supporting applications that you have to do this exact same thing with. And so you'd find companies that were relatively small with relatively large numbers of servers because they were just trying to keep everything separate. Then virtualization comes along and says, hey, we don't have to separate things at the app layer anymore because of that. We can actually separate things at the OS layer. And the way we do that is by running multiple operating systems at the same time on a single box. And then not just a single box, but a cluster of boxes that participate in what we call a farm in the industry. And this was huge cost savings, right? So instead of saying, okay, for your database, you need 2 SQL servers. For your email, you need 2 Exchange servers. For some application, you need 2 application servers, whatever. You don't have to do that anymore. Now you size your hardware needs as an aggregate across all of your software needs. And then the redundancy and the high availability and all those things, they all spilled into that. And so this brought down the overall cost of hardware that most companies would need, because now instead of just buying a box for purely the sake of separating the software, now you're buying boxes that operate everything, right? Well, on the consumer side of things, when I, thinking back to the separation of duties and how it lived in our own home, the main reason that we didn't consolidate, other than risk, was also performance, right? We were worried that if the server was getting utilized, that it would cause problems on the desktop. For the same reason that when back in the 90s, if you gamed on a PC, you would probably consider turning off every service running in Windows before you'd start gaming, because if something was happening in the background of Windows while you were playing a game, it could affect your frame rate, right? So we wouldn't want anything impacting our current experience that's running in the background. That was the whole concept. But nowadays, with, again, these crazy high core counts, there's just excess performance just spilling over on modern processors. And now with Unraid 6, we were able to showcase a to run Windows, get a gaming desktop, workhorse experience out of a desktop PC, get that experience running as a VM, and still have all of my services running on the server OS. And the beauty of this was I could separate the duties of the server and the desktop from one another, because the desktop runs as a subordinate. It's running as a virtual machine under the server. And so anytime I need to reboot that VM, if something goes wrong in that VM, it's completely isolated and independent from the host itself. Separately, we were able to isolate the CPU cores, or the logical CPUs, that were being assigned to the VM from what was running on the host. This way, applications that were running on the server would touch CPU cores that were completely independent from the gaming VM, so that when you're playing a game and someone's watching a movie via Plex, there's no issues there. There's no context switching happening on those CPU cores that's causing degraded performance for the desktop. So this is really a huge thing, because this enabled me to go from having 2 major costly devices in my home to 1. And now I have more than one, again, because I work for the company and we have tons of test hardware everywhere. And Yeah, it's a whole nother problem for another day. But the point is that if you're not working for Line Tech, you could still have one box in your house. So it's a really big solution because, back in the day, the sheer cost of a second computer, especially one that's going to have that many hard drives in it, you'd end up sacrificing a bit on the gaming side potentially. So you'd say, okay, I have this much money to spend this year on computer stuff, right? That's how it works for most families. I know that's how it works for my household. And I'd say, well, I really want this server because I want it to store all my personal digital content, and I like the benefits of owning a home server. And then separately, I really like gaming. I'm a big time gamer. I love Escape from Tarkov. If you like Tarkov, hit me up. Let's get some games. So I'd have these two devices, and I'd go, well, this year I got to upgrade the server a bit, and I want to upgrade the computer a bit. So I guess instead of getting that RTX 3090 that I really want, maybe I'll scale down and I'll get just a 2080, or maybe I'll go a little older, or maybe I'll get a lower CPU, or I'll put less memory in it. And then on the server side, maybe instead of getting 16 terabyte drives, I'll get 8 terabyte drives, and maybe I'll go with a slightly lower end this or lower end that. And so you start making sacrifices and trade-offs. But then when you sit back and you look at these two things, you're like, wait a minute. I got more horsepower over here than I need, right? And I've got storage over here that's not even being utilized. So why can't I combine the two? Well, the answer is you can. And so now, instead of spending, buying two motherboards, two sets of memory, two cases, two power supplies, two everything, instead of doing that, you build one beefy box and you put in a good processor, you put in a good graphics card, and you put in plenty of storage, and you actually end up spending less money because it's one machine. So that's huge. And keep in mind, this is barely scratching the surface of what you can do with a server. We've just covered a couple things today on this episode that you can do with an Unraid box, but there's plenty more. So discovering what's possible and seeing what you can actually do with your own personal server is another big thing that should drive people to wanting to own one. All right, so I think now you should have enough ammunition to convince that friend of yours who hasn't made the plunge to go get a server for their home or business. And next up, I want to cover a big announcement that was recently made by NVIDIA. So ever since the launch of Unraid 6, we've supported a pretty amazing feature called GPU pass-through, which we just talked about. And this feature is what allows you to assign that physical GPU from Unraid to a virtual machine and use that VM like that local desktop with near bare metal performance. And since this feature's inclusion, we at Line Tech have had to jump through a number of hoops in our OS to make sure that NVIDIA GPU pass-through worked correctly. And for a time, it was actually believed that NVIDIA didn't want to support this use case, and there's always been a slight fear in the back of our minds that one day they might make more efforts to actively block this, even though they'd never publicly stated as such. But on March 30th, an article was added to the NVIDIA knowledge base that shows their commitment to support pass-through of GeForce devices for use with Windows VMs, specifically highlighting two use cases. The first, they might as well have just said Unraid users, because they said users that want to run Linux as a host and Windows as a guest for gaming purposes. That's pretty much Unraid. Like, I understand you can do it on any Linux platform, which is why they were, agnostic to the OS. But let's be clear. I think that there's more people running Windows as a VM for gaming on Unraid than any other Linux platform out there. I would be shocked if I was wrong about that, just because that's something that we've supported since day one, and we've built into the software as base functionality. No jumping through hoops or having to apply custom patches or any of that stuff. The other use case that NVIDIA highlighted was gaming developers that want to be able to test their game against multiple OSs on a single machine, which I do know that is a valid use case. In fact, I'm pretty sure we have a customer that I'm not going to say who, because that'd be, violation of privacy, but I'm pretty sure we have a customer that's doing exactly that. So this is a huge step forward for virtualized gaming setups, as it showcases goodwill from NVIDIA that they intend to officially support this. And existing Unraid users, you guys don't have to do anything, as we've supported the use of these devices in VMs since the launch of version 6. But we are going to be looking closely at what other impacts this official support may have to both performance and NVLink support. Now, for those that don't know, NVLink is just the new term for SLI, and for those that don't know, what that refers to is the idea of having multiple GPUs tethered together, linked together to combine their performance for a single OS. So normally you would do that just in bare metal Windows. You'd have, let's say a RTX 3090 and another RTX 3090, and there'd be a little bridge device that would plug into both cards, connecting them to one another. And then in Windows would recognize this pair of devices and games would then be able to load balance their performance needs between those GPUs. Now, I'll be perfectly honest here. There's definitely a diminishing return on doing this. It's not like, oh, I get 60 frames per second with one card, so I'll get 120 with two. It doesn't work that way. There's definitely a diminishing return, but you get more performance out of it. And what I've always wanted is I've really wanted this to work for VMs, and it hasn't. Frankly, there's some voodoo black magic happening with SLI and NVLink that we just don't understand, and there's no real exposure to it in a way that we can work around to make it work within a VM. So what would happen is if you pass through multiple GPUs to a VM, that would work, but only for the purposes of leveraging those GPUs as, frankly, what we call CUDA cores, leveraging the CUDA cores, which is a way of using GPUs for non-gaming purposes, right? So I'm trying to think of a good example, but like I guess maybe Bitcoin mining would be a good example. I don't know, but there's plenty of things that developers can use multiple GPUs for to perform like bulk computing functions that don't even leverage the NVLink technology. Because what NVLink does is it makes the cards smart, and it lets them understand that one application is going to use both, and it's going to load balance that one application's need across both. Whereas the concept of using the CUDA cores, it's really using each device independent from one another and just giving it different workloads. So I would love to see if this new quote-unquote official support in the latest drivers changes anything with NVLink support, because to me, that would be a huge use case for us. Because now, like for example, if you have a setup where you have a dual gaming setup, right, where you have two GPUs in a single Unraid instance, and they're each powering two different Windows VMs. This way, if you had a buddy come over, you both could play games off the same PC, right? Like Linus did a video on this at the very beginning of Unraid 6, showcasing two gamers, one CPU. But wouldn't it be neat if that other guy wasn't there, if you could just take that second GPU, put it into your VM, and now leverage the benefits of both? That would be freaking awesome. So we want to test this. So I actually pinged Linus from Linus Tech Tips as soon as I read the article and said, hey man, can you give me remote access to like a high-end like dual RTX system with Unraid on it so we can try this with the newest drivers and see if this dual GPU pass-through is possible? And he said he's going to try. He's going to try to get that set up for me. So hopefully we'll cover that in a future episode, and maybe he'll cover it in his own in a video of his own. So we'll see. But yeah, this is a huge announcement from NVIDIA. We're really happy to see that they're doing that. Now maybe we can get AMD to do it too. I don't know. Let's keep our fingers crossed, because if we can get AMD on the same board or same boat as NVIDIA, that would be really great. AMD devices have notoriously been much more difficult to achieve stable GPU pass-through with. They've gotten better on certain devices, but sometimes it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There's just not enough consistency. You know, I can tell you right now that if you get pretty much any modern NVIDIA GPU, specifically EVGA branded, because I know that they do a great job with their firmware to make sure it supports UEFI, which is what we use for VMs by default, that they all should work. So with AMD, it's more of a what series GPU and which kind of, did you update the BIOS or not on the GPU firmware or the VBIOS, or like there's just so many little things that determine. And then sometimes there's custom patches you have to apply or custom drivers that you have to modify. There's a lot more challenges with AMD. So I'd love to see AMD step up and officially support this as well, because I really want to give users the power of choice. You know, you should be able to choose whatever hardware you want and pass it through ubiquitously, and that's just not the way it works today. And as much as we want it to, there's not a lot we can do from our side to make that possible without the vendor officially supporting it. Okay, well, that about wraps it up for the first episode of the Uncast. If you're interested in trying out Unraid and joining the home server revolution, you can get started by going to www.unraid.net/download. Thanks again for listening to the episode. Make sure to follow and subscribe for future content, and I'll see you again real soon.